February 2nd, 1943. The history books tell you this is when the Battle of Stalingrad ended. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered, and 91,000 exhausted, frostbitten survivors of the German 6th Army were marched off to Soviet captivity. A clean ending to one of the bloodiest battles in human history. But that's only half the truth. And today, you're going to understand exactly what happened to the thousands of Germans who refused to surrender. And it's more disturbing than you could even imagine. Soviet records reveal that over 11,000 German troops continued fighting long after that official surrender date. They dug in and resisted, forcing the Red Army to conduct brutal mopping up operations for weeks. The Soviets called them counter-revolutionary elements. But first, so you'd understand better why these soldiers made this choice, we have to start with how they ended up trapped in the first place. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the campaign was devastatingly successful, until the Russian winter and Soviet resistance stopped the advance just short of Moscow. By spring 1942, Hitler had a new plan. Instead of going for Moscow again, he gambled everything on the south. The objective was the Caucasus oil fields. Without oil, the Soviet war machine would grind to a halt. But between the German armies and those oil fields stood the Caucasus Mountains, peaks exceeding 18,000 feet with only one practical road through. And before that, another obstacle, Stalingrad. The city sat on the Volga River, a massive artery that funneled critical resources across Russia. If the Germans could capture it, they'd effectively split the Soviet Union in two, take Stalingrad, and everything else collapses. Instead of securing the city intact, the Luftwaffe bombed it into hellfire. Beginning in late August 1942, wave after wave of German bombers turned Stalingrad into skeletal ruins. The shattered buildings created a nightmare for German tanks, but a paradise for Soviet defenders. Snipers and riflemen made homes in the wreckage. Every wall was a fortress, every basement a bunker. The railway station changed hands 14 times in just 6 hours. Soldiers fought room to room, sometimes arm's length apart. After 3 months of savage combat, the Germans had clawed their way to 90% of the city. The cost was enormous. Over 60,000 men lost, including 15,000 dead or missing. While this brutal urban fighting was underway, the Soviets were preparing a trap. The Germans had left their flanks guarded by Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian forces. A 120-mile stretch north of the city was thinly held by the Hungarian Second Army, troops who lacked the weapons, vehicles, and training of German forces. The southern flank was equally exposed. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. A massive pincer attack that tore through the Hungarian and Romanian lines. By November 23rd, they had encircled 265,000 Axis troops. The entire German 6th Army was trapped. Paulus repeatedly requested permission to withdraw and fight his way out west. Hitler refused. The Germans tried to supply the 6th Army by air. The Luftwaffe failed to deliver the daily tonnage needed. A desperate relief operation was launched in December. It failed. Winter made everything worse. By January 24th, Paulus radioed that there were 18,000 wounded with no bandages or medical supplies. On January 26th, Soviet attacks split the German defense into a northern and southern pocket. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, the Führer promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. Since no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered, Hitler expected him to fight to the death or take his own life. On January 31st, the southern pocket collapsed. Paulus was captured in his headquarters. He claimed he hadn't surrendered but had been taken by surprise, and therefore refused to order the remaining forces to surrender. General Karl Strecker commanded the 11th Corps in the northern sector. By late January, his group was almost entirely cut off. Determined to hold out, Strecker banned his staff from committing suicide and issued an order that any soldier moving toward the Soviets would be shot on sight. On February 1st, after confirmation that Paulus had surrendered, Strecker told his officers the situation was hopeless and gave them freedom to act according to their conscience. On February 2nd, after renewed Soviet assaults, Strecker surrendered. Paulus and 22 generals were held under tolerable conditions as VIPs, but for most of the 91,000 German prisoners, Captured starving, exhausted, and diseased, Soviet treatment was a death sentence. They were forced to march in winter conditions to labor camps where they died from malnutrition, wounds, diseases like typhus, cold, and forced labor. Only around 5,000 ever returned to Germany. Here's why that matters. German soldiers knew what was waiting for them because they knew what Germany had done to Soviet prisoners. The Germans had treated Soviet POWs with monstrous cruelty. An estimated 3 million Soviet prisoners had died from hunger, neglect, and cold in the first 2 years of the war. Many never even made it to proper camps. They were simply left to starve or freeze to death in the open. Now the roles were reversed. Better to die quickly with a rifle in hand than waste away behind barbed wire. That's what drove thousands of German soldiers to keep hiding in the ruins. Even after Strecker's surrender, thousands of German soldiers refused to lay down their arms. In small units, groups, or completely alone, they went to ground, living in basements or sewers, hiding by day, foraging for supplies at night. After the official German surrender at Stalingrad, approximately 11,000 soldiers refused to lay down their arms and continued to resist the Soviets for several weeks. While letters from these specific holdouts are not widely publicized, letters from other German soldiers within the Stalingrad pocket reveal why many were driven to fight until the end. The accounts that emerged from the battle show that these holdouts preferred a bitter end over Soviet captivity, and many were ideologically committed to fighting for Germany and Hitler. Soviet units under NKVD direction were ordered to track down these holdouts, to capture or eliminate them. The 10th NKVD Division, which had been operating in the Stalingrad sector since the previous summer, took the lead. They were reinforced by the 252nd Rifle Division. Soviet records indicate that 2,418 Germans were killed in these post-surrender sweeps, most in close-quarter firefights or burned out of hiding. In the first week, Soviet troops swept through the city, engaging in firefights with isolated pockets and driving them out of the sewer systems. On February 5th, headquarters reported that its 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade discovered 18 German soldiers hiding in a basement. When they refused to surrender, all were killed in the ensuing firefight. Some of the fiercest resistance occurred in the sewers, death traps where Soviet troops had to smoke out fugitives, often encountering ambushes or mines in narrow crawl spaces. Some attempted to reach German lines. In March 1943, the NKVD reported cases of German officers and soldiers trying to cross Soviet lines to reach German-held territory over 400 kilometers away. One report stated, on the way, they commit acts of robbery and murder. Some Germans infiltrate villages where they acquire civilian or military clothing from locals to better disguise themselves. The entire Stalingrad region was ordered swept clean. The NKVD reported several cases of Germans escaping from POW camps. By the end of March 1943, the NKVD reported that 8,646 Germans had been captured, in addition to the 2,418 already killed. Despite their efforts, virtually none managed to reach German lines. The official estimate suggests over 11,000 troops went to ground after the surrender, but that number comes from incomplete Soviet NKVD communications focused mainly on confirmed kills and captures. When you consider the original force of around 300,000 trapped inside the pocket, subtract the known killed in action and the 91,000 who surrendered, there's still a gap. Many died from wounds, frostbite, starvation, or illness without being officially counted. But thousands more may have been killed while fleeing, buried under snowdrifts, or captured in rural sweeps not connected to the official count. Captured German soldiers gave us a window into their thinking. One officer explained, "First of all, the main force under Field Marshal Paulus had surrendered on January 30th. Continued resistance was senseless. Our group wasn't able to draw in enough Russian forces to justify the sacrifice. Second, we had so many wounded that they impaired our ability to fight. They were packed into every other building. All would have been killed by artillery fire if we'd resisted any longer." Another described the final days, thousands of dead bodies and wounded men dying in the streets because hospitals were overcrowded. We were taking heavy fire from artillery and aircraft. The surrender wasn't organized. We only learned about it after the Russians had already showed up. By early January, regiments no longer existed. Individual groups were created that went by the names of officers in charge. By around January 20th, they were getting 50 grams of bread per day. Despite strict orders and the threat of being shot, Airdrop food supplies were taken by whoever found them. Discipline was worsening, and there was more talk of surrender. One German officer described the mindset. The idea was widespread that being captured by the Russians meant poor treatment, torture, and death. The men had all read the Russian leaflets saying prisoners were treated well. Some had photographs showing prisoners' lives in Russia, but no one believed it. During the advance, many had seen bodies of men who'd been shot in the head. That convinced us the Russians were shooting prisoners. There's a scene in the 1993 German film Stalingrad where a group of small German soldiers discuss trying to escape the city. They speak in hushed tones, trading rumors about routes west, disguises, and possible civilian clothes. That conversation must have happened thousands of times in real life. How many tried? How many froze to death only miles from possible safety? Over 11,000 stories buried forever in the pages of Stalingrad. Men who chose to keep fighting or hiding rather than face Soviet captivity. Men who knew they were already dead but refused to go quietly. The German treatment of Soviet prisoners, 3 million dead from deliberate neglect, made Soviet revenge inevitable. The German soldiers who hid in Stalingrad's ruins knew this. They'd seen what Germany did, so they hid in sewers, fought from basements, tried to disguise themselves as civilians, and attempted impossible escapes across frozen territory. Most died in the attempt, shot in firefights, burned out of hiding, or frozen to death. Of the 91,000 who did surrender, only 5,000 ever saw Germany again. The 11,000 who refused, they bought themselves a few more weeks of life in the ruins, and then most died anyway, just in different ways. There are no monuments for these men, no graves, no names etched in stone. Their stories were swallowed by the ruins they died in. The official history closed the chapter on February 2nd because it makes for a clean narrative, but the real end came weeks later through gunfire in alleyways, through hunted men hiding in silence, and through desperate final fights that left no witnesses. That's the truth about Stalingrad. It didn't end with a surrender, it ended with a manhunt.